So this is actually class number 21 on the Golden Doves. However, we're going to be reviewing the older classes, the material from the older classes. So for those of you who've already gone up to class number 20, you don't need to watch this class. It's just a review. I would recommend that you go to class number 22 when that's posted, and we'll take it from there. So for those of you who want the review, we're in the introduction in page Roman numeral 16. 5 closely related areas are examined here. Go ahead.
The focus of this work is a rabbinic passage examined in the final chapter, distinguishing between the idea as originally conceived in the mind of the first person and the idea as processed into language and communicated to the second person.
Right. So there is a Midrash, and the Midrash will actually be examined in the final chapter, chapter 5. And that Midrash, it deals with the tension between the thought that a person has, the idea that a person has, right? And then the person who has that thought wants to express the thought. So to express the thought, he has to transform the thought into language because he wants to communicate it to the second person.
Mm-hmm.
But there's always going to be a tension between the thought and the articulation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the main point of this book.
Mm-hmm. In its pristine stage, the idea is designated here ideality, in the sense of totally unambiguous thought prior to articulation, in contradistinction to the thought as grasped by the second person after and through articulation.
Right.
Right.
And if we're to get a little deeper into the subject, you have the thought in the mind of the first person, which is the actual thought, right? It's untarnished. The first person knows what he's thinking and he knows what he's feeling,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you have the second person who transforms the language that he hears into his own thought.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those two things are not going to be quite the same, right? There's going to be a slight divergence between what the second person is thinking, that he understands from the mind of the first person, and what the first person is actually thinking in his mind. It's never going to be quite the same.
Mm-hmm. Using the verse golden doves with silver dots as a metaphor, the rabbis identified golden doves with the divine oraculum prior to articulation, and silver dots with the oraculum as processed into language and communicated to the people of Israel.
Right. So the memra of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Achat Diber Elohim, that's the oraculum. Hashem speaks to us,
Mm-hmm.
right? Kol Gadol Velo Yasaf.
Mm-hmm.
That's the voice of God speaking to Am Yisrael. So the voice of God is unambiguous. Hashem knows exactly and
It's unambiguous to
precisely.
Hashem.
Well, yeah, exactly right. Hashem knows, correct. Hashem knows exactly and precisely what it is that He is saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the golden doves. But then it's changed into language. The Kol Gadol Velo Yasaf, it sounds like a shofar. But the Jewish people, they change the sound of the shofar and they process it and they hear it as Anochi Adonai Elohecha Asher Hosoticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim Mibet Avadim Lo Yelecha Elohim Achnim Apanai. Right? So there's going to be a slight tension between the original Torah,
Mm-hmm.
as Hashem understands it and perceives it, and the Torah that the Jewish people, which is a linguistic Torah, right? And that linguistic Torah is not equal to the perceived Torah by Hashem.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar and very similar, but it's not identical.
Mm-hmm. As with gold and silver, ideality and articulation could be equivalent, but ultimately they are not reducible to one another. How's it equivalent?
Okay. That's a very good question. And before I said it's not equal, it's not true.
With shape,
It's
maybe.
equal, it's not identical. I don't know if you notice the change in so the golden doves is Hashem's perception of the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
The silver dots is the language of the Torah. Anochi Adonai Elohecha.
Mm-hmm.
It's a transformation of the thought into linguistics.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
It's like you need the silver dots.
Of course. Well,
no, I always thought, in my mind, I always saw the golden doves and the silver dots. Like I saw the silver dots as covering the golden doves, and that it really, in an ideal situation, you wouldn't need those silver dots covering it.
Right.
But here we're seeing that it's actually you need it.
Right, because
if you
human
didn't
mind.
have it, then there would be no
Right.
golden doves to.
And the reason
to
is
take a while.
the reason is Vahi Adam lenefesh haya. So the wisdom of man is attained through speech. It's a linguistic intelligence. So that's why speech is of the silver dots is of the essence. Without the silver dots, you can never perceive anything of the golden doves. But here's the point. You said, why is it equal and not identical? Because gold, a pound of gold, you can actually say it's equal to whatever it is, 50 pounds of silver in value. But even though a pound of gold is equal to 50 pounds of silver, assuming that's the same ratio, it's not identical. A pound of gold is not identical to 50 pounds of silver.
I thought actually, like shape and size, you could have a bowl of gold and a bowl of silver, the same size, the same shape. They look the same, they act the same, but it's different.
No. He's talking here about value, equal. So it could be that Anochi Adonai Elohecha Asher Osati Chames Yisrael is equal to the perception that God had, but it's not identical. The way Hashem perceives Anochi Adonai Elohecha is not the way we perceive it. So you see, things can be equal but not identical.
Interesting. Silver lacks the absolute density of value represented by gold. For the rabbis, lucidity and linguistic density are correlative. Correlative. Diffusion is a function of confusion.
Yeah. So this is a great example how something could be equal but not identical. And one of the great examples is, so a pound of gold is equal to 50 pounds of silver. So what's the difference? It's the same thing. No, because when you have to express yourself in many, many words, for the Chachamim, that's a negative, right? For the Chachamim, the denser the language, the denser the formulation, the more precise the thought that comes with that language. So here we see, no, it's not identical. It may be equal.
There's a perennial residue, the specific appurtenance of the golden doves, that will always elude the system of value of the silver dots.
And finally, because gold is not silver, as much as you try to make the silver close to gold, it's never going to be quite there. There's always going to be an appurtenance. An appurtenance means there's going to be something slightly off, slightly off.
That 0.001% that defines the golden doves, which the silver dots don't have.
Yes.
Like the Semiological verses. That will always elude the system of value, or between ideality and articulation lies the concept of iteration of repeatability.
Okay, this is a great chidush. So then what do? So if the silver dots is never going to be quite identical to the golden doves, how can you come closer and closer to the golden doves? And the answer is through Veshinantam Levanecha, through repeating it in different language. First you say Bereshit to the end of the book of the Midbar. Okay, and then you repeat the Torah in the book of Devarim, Eleha Devarim. You repeat it. So every time you repeat it, you're saying the silver dots slightly differently, and you're covering a part of the golden doves that you didn't get before. Or capturing a part of the golden doves that you didn't get before. So that's the idea of shinunim, the shinunim beficha.
Here, iteration involves the transformation of the original into a system of values.
Right, so you take the original, and then you try to transform it into speech. A system of values means a system that has values. It could be an economic system, it could be a mathematical system, it could be a linguistic system. In this case, it's the linguistic system. What does it mean, a system of values? There are words. Each word has a particular value. For example, the word dog means dog. The word scared means scared. It could also mean a few other things. And there's words have semantic fields. So you're taking the ideality and you're transforming it into a system of values. I'll give you an example. In physics, you have an ideality, you have a thought, an idea about physics, and you want to reduce it into a system of values. You won't use the linguistic system of values, you use the mathematical system of values, namely E equals mc squared, for example, right? That's a system of values.
Without transformation, repetition is impossible. The repetition, however, is never identical to the original.
There you go.
And that's the point of the repetition. It shouldn't be identical to the original. The preceding bears directly upon the relationship between the written and the oral law. For Judaism, there are two Torahs, the written law, or Hebrew scriptures, and the oral law, which includes all the legal teachings, lore, and commentaries transmitted by the rabbis.
So interesting. So he's saying that this tension between golden doves and silver dots has to do with the relationship between Torah shebichtav and Torah shebe'al peh. Why? What is that? So first of all, the Torah shebe'al peh, of course, includes all of the halachot, all of the Haggadot, all of the Perushim of the Torah Shebichtav, which are, of course, the official ones. We're not talking about the nonsensical ones, okay?
It will be seen that a semiological relationship prevails between the written and the oral law, in which the oral law is the interpreter system and the written law is the interpreted system.
Right. And now, okay, so let's say how golden dove, silver dots has to do with Torah Shebichtav, Torah Shebe'al Peh. But first, Torah Shebichtav versus Torah Shebe'al Peh, there is a semiological relationship. Semi means milashon siman. So semiological means something to do with simanim. So, for example, I see there and I'm pointing at a flower pot. So the flower pot is a siman for what I have in my mind, right? So that's semiological.
I thought semiology, correct me if I'm wrong, also has to do with the syntagmatic opposition between the different semiological
it does.
elements.
Right. I mean, we can study the science semiology.
No, right. Just to,
and you're right.
Understand the exact,
you're right.
Specifically with Torah Shebichtav,
right.
Via syntagmatic opposition, things derive meaning, and then the Torah Shebe'al Peh explains what the meaning is.
I agree with you, and we will go into all of that. Everything you said is correct. We will study all of that. This is just like we're just the introduction, and it's telling us ma anachnu nilmad b'sefer. But there's a semiological relationship, and namely, how is it a semiological relationship? The oral law interprets the written law, right? So the interpretation of the word flower pot is that flower pot, or the flower pot that I have in my mind, right? So there's interpreter interprets it over the Braille system. The interpretation of D means please come quickly. Making that up.
This type of relationship cannot be inverted. The interpreter system cannot be interpreted by any other system.
Right.
And then that's important, by any other system.
Right. So you can't have the Torah Shebe'al Peh further interpreted, meaning the Torah Shebichtav can be interpreted by the Torah Shebe'al Peh, right? But the Torah Shebe'al Peh cannot be interpreted by another system because it's recognized, right? The Torah Shebe'al Peh is recognized. If you need to interpret the Torah Shebe'al Peh, that means you don't recognize it. Let me explain this to you because I remember I elaborated on it, and it's important.
Why? I have a good example in my mind.
No, but let me tell you, Mishnayot. Why is it that the Jewish people didn't need a kehati when they studied in Ohel Moed, the Torah Shebe'al Peh? We need kehati. They didn't need kehati. Why do we need kehati and they didn't need kehati? And the answer is because the Torah Shebe'al Peh was part of their lay mental. What does that mean? It means that their minds naturally understood the Torah Shebe'al Peh. It was part of their mental system. So they didn't need an explanation of what the Torah Shebe'al Peh is. So when they had the Torah system, namely Torah Shebe'al Peh, and it was used to interpret the Torah Shebichtav, if you need another system to interpret your lay mental, then it's not your lay mental. It's not your Torah Shebe'al Peh. You understand? Today we need it because we're so far removed from the Jewish way of thinking that the lay mental of the Jews now is for us as a foreign system, and we need a Torah Shebe'al Peh to explain that.
But we might,
or an interpreter system to explain that.
One might say just the lay mental of 2,000 years ago, which is a little different than the lay mental of today, because there is a lay mental. There's always going to be a mental law, some sort of mental law, which, in other words, your intellectual apparatus through which you view what you view. However, it's obviously not the mental law that the Jews had 2,000 years ago in Eretz Israel of the Mishnayot, of the Tanaim.
Yes, however, had things gone properly and had we continued to study Torah and not divert to Avodah Zarah or Eastern European Chassidut, then we would not have needed special commentaries to explain to us the meaning of things, because it would have just been a natural progression in our knowledge, and the progression in knowledge doesn't negate the previous, it just builds upon the previous. Today, there's been a terrible split between Jewish way of thinking, Jewish lay mental, and the common contemporary way of thinking. The contemporary way of thinking is foreign to the Jewish way of thinking, and vice versa. The Jewish way of thinking is foreign to the contemporary way of thinking. That's why things like Hasidut are so appealing to many, because they don't know Judaism anymore.
I agree that there's a split. And also just came to mind the famous Midrash when Moshe Rabbeinu ends up in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva.
Ah, nice.
And I know Zdada writes something about it.
Does.
I know there's a common interpretation for it.
Yeah.
That the Torah and the Rabbi Akiva was difficult, was completely different mental, like different language, different
Yes.
was dealing with different things in the Torah, and there's a Moshe Rabbeinu.
Yes. Yes. No, by the way, that's a great example
That explained in a
of
way, in
how,
a specific way.
we progress so far that, like, imagine a physicist coming to a university today, Columbia University, Princeton University, and
Physicists
sitting,
from 300
let's say,
years ago.
Isaac Newton,
Yeah.
coming today to a class of physics. He may have some trouble initially understanding it,
Right.
because things have progressed so much, but they progress based upon Isaac Newton.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, classical physics still applies. So now let's go to the Akiva. The Akiva still applies. We still study his halachot, his mishnayot, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the idea there is that there would have been such progress, and Am Yisrael continues to study, that even though the Akiva would not be in tune with the contemporary ideas, not because the contemporary ideas reject the previous ideas, but because the contemporary ideas have progressed so far that now he has to kind of get back into it, and he could get back into it. Isaac Newton can get back into our physics the same way the Akiva can get back into the Torah of Yemot HaMashiach.
So in a sense, what you're saying is that the difference between today's lack of understanding of the layman tal of 2,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago's lack of understanding of the layman tal 1,000 years before them is that today our layman tal isn't different. It rejects, it negates the previous.
I wouldn't
And
even
their
call it
layman
layman
tal
tal.
doesn't reject the previous. It
Right.
just is.
Right, and by the way, I wouldn't even call it layman tal anymore.
I know,
Today
I'm
we're
using
just
it
like,
to,
today we just have a goy culture, and our minds are shaped by the goy culture, and we get excited by words like racism. Oh my gosh, like you can call this thing, this is racist.
Black.
Oh my gosh,
It's
it's
black
racist.
tile.
Right, exactly. And people have no critical judgment anymore. They just, everything is like, Pavlovian reactions. So you hear the bell. Oh my gosh, did you just say that's racism, or did you just say that's racist, or right? So nothing has any meaning.
By the way, you're a white supremacist. You can't be speaking like that.
Okay. All right.
Right. So, accordingly, right. Spanish-speaking Sephardim designate the oral law layman tal. We just spoke about mental law, since it is representative of the cultural and hermeneutical codes of the Jewish people.
And therefore, they didn't need an explanation. So they didn't need Kehati. But I want to say this. I just don't want anybody to miss. I love Kehati. I consider him to be an outstanding Talmid Chacham, and he did a tremendous contribution on Sal. I don't even want there to be any mistake about that. Really, we're privileged that we live after the generation of Kehati and not before. So I don't want Chasva. Tremendous, but we need it.
We studied with Rabbi Pinchas Kehati.
Right, exactly. But the fact is, we need it because we're so divorced from the layman tal of our fathers. No longer exists in our minds, at least.
The oral law is the interpretation of codes of the Jewish people. The oral law, right? It cannot be equivalent to the true, i.e., original Torah declared Rabbi Yosef ben Megas, one of the foremost rabbinic figures of the Iberian Peninsula.
Right. So of course, even though the Torah Shabbat Peh explains the Torah Shebichtav, it's not equal to the Torah Shebichtav.
Right. The most authoritative collection of the oral law is the Mishnah, compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Mishnah means text, formulation. This term is connected.
What does that mean? Shana. How does Mishnah mean text?
Nishon lishanot, shinui.
But what does it mean formulation?
Because every time you reiterate it, it has a little bit of a shinui. No?
I know, but what does it mean text? What does Mishnah means text? Formulation. Mishnah means formula, a formula. Okay, let's think about that. Maybe later on, remind me later, we'll look at the Bionami Janah, maybe the David Kempkin. What does the word Mishnah mean text? Okay, continue. Yeah?
No, this term is connected with the biblical obligation to transmit the words of God to the children. But it doesn't say text.
Right, but it's talking, okay, when it says Vishnantam, it means the words. A words is a text. By the way, a text doesn't have to be written. A text is a specific formulation of words.
It's a reshima, not
right,
katuv.
Exactly. No, what do you mean it's a shum no katuv? No. No, not at all. But the point is that a text doesn't have to be a written text. So when it says Vishnantam levanecha, it implies a text. So you're going to give a very precise formulation of words. I'm telling you, it's Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, and not Moshe Hashem diber el Moshe, right? Right? Or it's right? It's this order, not that order. Repeat the words like this. Me'amatai korin et shema be'avit, not mimatai omrim keriat shema balayla.
Yeah.
That's a text.
Mishnah, right. Right. Accordingly, it is not an intransitive verb denoting a reflexive action.
Right. Beshinantam is not something you do yourself. For example, ani yoshem, that's something you do to yourself, right? Ani yoshev, that's something you do to yourself.
Reflexive.
But so when you say ani shonen, you don't do shonen. You're shonen
Ani mishonen.
something.
Right.
Ani mishanen, right? It's a po'al yoseh, not a po'al omed. It's a transitive verb, not an intransitive verb.
Mishnah derives from the root shana, meaning both change and transmission.
Leshanot mashu means to change. So why do you say when you transmit, you change, and when you I think there's a squirrel throwing things from the tree. He probably wants to eat it later. Okay. Okay.
Meaning both change and transmission. Articulation or formulation is a transitive action effected through a change which makes transmission possible. That's the hidush.
Read that sentence again.
Articulation or formulation is a transitive action effected through a change which makes transmission possible.
Beautiful. Yeah. So what he's saying here is very amor. In order for a Rav to transmit to his Talmid, right, he needs to change the text a little. Meaning, the way I teach you is a bit different than the way Jeda taught me, because I was raised in one sense, in one context, and you were raised in a different context. So the words I use to transmit the text are going to change a little, right?
Mm-hmm. Transformation is a basic linguistic process affecting both the common language and the language of dreams. Interesting. What is the language of dreams?
So hold on one second. Just 1 second. I just want to summarize what we just said until now, and then I want to fix something that I said. So the Torah shebichtav is the golden doves. The Torah shebe'al peh is the silver dots. And in that way, the Torah shebe'al peh, it allows you to have access to the Torah shebichtav. Without the Torah shebe'al peh, you can never access the Torah shebichtav. Okay. But then there's the idea of leshanot, to transmit and to change. So when the Chachamim, for example, have the Torah shebe'al peh, comes Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and he gives it a specific formulation, right? Mm-hmm. So he's mishaneh, the existing Torah shebe'al peh, and he gives it a new system of value. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then you have Harambam. Harambam comes and does the Mishneh Torah. So he wants to transmit the Torah shebe'al peh, so he changes the formulation, and then now Harambam gives us the Torah shebe'al peh in a slightly different version. What I said before, me teaching you or Jeda teaching me, is incorrect. I don't think that's correct. No. When I teach you, I have to draw upon one of the systems, whether it's a Mishnayot, whether it's the Gemara, the Beraitot, the Sifra, the Sifreh, or the Mishneh Torah, because those are reformulations of the Torah shebe'al peh. Perhaps when the Mashiach comes, there will be a new reformulation of the Torah shebe'al peh. Possibly, right?
The same reformulation nevertheless has an official stance.
Right, exactly.
There's official reformulations, but can't there be an unofficial reformulation? The reformulation
yes, the Chachamim,
is unofficial.
Before the Mishnayot, yes. Before Rabbeinu HaKadosh wrote the Mishnayot, every Chacham formulated the Torah shebe'al peh. Right. So all this is true until the days of the Mishnayot. But now, because of Rabbeinu HaKadosh set that formulation, that became the official formulation. But then came Rambam. So how did Rambam reformulate the Torah shebe'al peh? Because when Rabbeinu HaKadosh reformulated the Torah shebe'al peh, he only reformulated it from the unofficial, no text, zero text, to here's an official text, here it is. Mm-hmm. But then we had the Gemara, and the Gemara was the official lessons on the Mishnayot. So Rambam took now the Gemara and the Mishnayot, and he reformulated that into a new official text, which now brings the Gemara and the Mishnayot. Mm-hmm. So that's now. But what happened now? Once we have those formulations, there are no other formulations of the Torah shebe'al peh. That's it. So it's not when I teach you now, I'm going to be reformulating the Torah Shebe'al Peh. No, I'm not. I'm not a Betin, and I'm not a Rambam, right? So,
But at the practical level, I'm saying, practically speaking, you are
yeah.
in a certain sense reformulating that Torah Shebe'al Peh, which you received from your Hacham.
Maybe only in the sense that
I'm saying just
at the language that we're
at the
speaking in
linguistic
English,
and teaching level, at the
okay, but that's not an official reformulation. Meaning, this that I'm teaching you now, let's say I would teach you
at the
Mishnayot.
pedagogical level,
Yeah.
you're reformulating.
Okay, fair enough.
And structurally, it's a similar matter.
Okay, all right, I see what you're saying.
The only reason I'm saying is because when you understand it that way, it makes it easier to understand the previous reformulations that were.
Yes. Okay, let's continue. So transformation is a basic linguistic process. So when you speak words, what you're actually doing is you're transforming thoughts into something else. A thought is not a word, right? But you're transforming those thoughts into words. That's what linguistics is about.
Mm-hmm.
And this has to do not just with the language that we speak, but it has to do with the halamot, with dreams. Because in dreams, you have a particular thought.
Mm-hmm.
And then whatever that mechanism is transforms that thought into these pictorial images or these video images that we see as dreams.
Mm-hmm. Arabic-speaking Jews distinguish two levels of language which are transformable but not reducible to one another. Sharah, meaning, represents the lexical sense of a term.
Okay, so that's like what we would call peshat, but not even peshat. It would mean, what does the word simla mean? The word simla, what does that word mean? So that's the sharach, right? What does ufarisu mean? That's the sharach, all right?
Right. Ma'na,
Significance.
represents the semantic sense of the sentence. By the way, in Arabic today, they still have those words. You know,
Are they good?
sharahni means, give me the translate it. And they shu ya'ani hada, shu ya'ani blah, you use the word shu ya'ani bathroom.
Yeah.
And then you have to explain what it is, not just the translation.
So shu ya'ani is from ma'ana?
I mean, ya'ani is like ma'ana, I think. I might be wrong, and so if anybody hears and thinks I'm wrong, correct me, but
Right.
I think ma'ana is like ya'ani, and shara is like translation. Just translate shara,
Right.
shara,
Right. So the ma'ana means you now put the words together in the sentence, and the words, that sentence now takes on a meaning that's independent of the lexical or dictionary meaning of each one of the words standing separately.
I mean, it's not necessarily equivalent to the lexical meaning. It may be.
No, it really can't be, because words are always affected by the words around them. Meaning one word always affects the word next to it in the sentence.
Explain what I mean, because a lot of times you have a word that's used in most cases in the following syntagmatic field.
Yeah.
And that's why that's the lexical meaning. However, you could put it in another case and it'll have a completely different meaning, which is
and that's
secondary meaning.
And
that's the
and that's the important point. So the lexical meaning can never tell you the mana. It may be true that there's a very close relationship between the two, maybe even equivalent, if you want to say that. But the mana is always based upon the words, each word acting as a context for every other word. And when a word acts as context for every other word, it gives a new meaning. All the words together give a new meaning.
The mana originates in the mind of the first sentence, of the first person, and then is processed into words and disturbed and then distributed in the sentence.
Right. So here's the way it works. Originally, you have the golden doves. The golden doves is the mana. That's what you have. You start out with mana. Mana is an idea. So in my mind, I want to make sure that Am Yisrael, they don't forget what Amalek did. Okay, that's the mana.
Mm-hmm. The mana originates in the Mehillah.
Oh, and then the second thing is Hashem speaks, and we process that speech into words, and we actually have Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. That's the sentence now that we perceive. In turn,
the second person, a reader, processes the words and synthesizes them into ma'ana.
Now the second person, right, which is Bnei Yisrael and Oel Moed, the one who processed the language, the Torah into language, is Moshe Rabbeinu, right? So Moshe Rabbeinu hears Tekiat HaShofar, and he processes that sound of Hashem, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. He now teaches the Jewish people Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. The Jewish people, the second person, they hear the words, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. And now we take those words, which is, each one has a lexical meaning. We know what the word Zachor means, we know what the word et means, and so on. And now we try to create our own ma'ana in our minds, meaning it starts out as golden doves, the Torah in Hashem, silver dots, the language of Pasuk, and then again it becomes golden doves in the mind of the second person.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, the sense of the ma'ana is conditioned by the hermeneutical and cultural code of the second person, or reader.
Because we're going to process the words, and we're going to process the words based on our hermeneutical code.
Aharon ben Moshe, one of the most authoritative biblical Masoretes, alludes to the fundamental changes present in speech when describing the psychological chain, the psychophysiological chain involved in the reading process.
Okay, so Aaron ben Moshe, he says, he alluded to the fundamental changes present in speech. There are certain changes that take place in speech, because he was describing the psychophysiological chain.
You can hear, he's going to explain it now.
Right, psychophysiological means, physiological means your physical state, your thing just happening in your physical body.
From the psyche to the physical,
exactly.
to the words, to the air of the world.
Right.
The idea in the mind of the reader moves the lungs, and then the lungs send air to the vocal organs, and the lips and mouth express the sense of writing, and writing is contained in words, and words in letters, and letters in script, and the lexical meaning is comprised in the semantic sense, and the sense is in the synthesis of the mind.
Right. Interesting. So it starts out with the person speaks, he moves his lungs, air comes out of the vocal cords, and then the lips and mouth express the words, right? And then the mind, the second person, he hears the words and synthesizes the words. Yeah, very interesting. Ibn
Bahuda described the speech process as a kind of writing or translation. Speech is the pen of the heart and the translator of the soul and the emissary of the thoughts.
So again, you see how the idea that language is actually a transformation of the thought. You have the thought, and then you have the language, which is the linguistic representation of that thought. So there's a transformative process taking place, but more importantly, that the speech is a type of malach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this is a malach that's used to convey your thinking to somebody else's mind. That's the malach.
A similar process is also present in the language of dreams. The dream that one recalls is a transformation of an original dream never remembered exactly, except in prophetic vision.
So, for example, you have a thought, something is bothering you. You saw that a Tamil Hacham was mitbazeh. Somebody bizat Tamil Hacham and it bothered you, but you continued on your day, and then in your mind, that thought is festering. And then when you go to sleep at night, you have a particular nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you don't remember you don't know what caused that nightmare, because all you see is the nightmare, whatever that nightmare was. So that's the transformation of a thought into a dream.
Mm-hmm. Rabbi Ishaq Karo suggested this principle when discussing Paro's dreams. Although Rabbi Karo was discussing prophetic dreams in particular, the principle of transformation applies to dreams in general. When one dreams a prophetic dream, one sees the truth itself. Paro had actually seen 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, but his imagination had transformed them into 7 cows and 7 stalks, since they resemble plenty and famine.
Right. So you have in the
representation.
Right. So among the Nevi'im, the Navi has a message that's emet, that comes from Hashem, and then that message is transformed into the Nevu'ah. Now the Navi remembers or understands the interpretation of the Nevu'ah.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel, for example, did not have the level of a Navi. Therefore, he doesn't always understand
that which is conveyed
his vision. So he sees his visions and he says that he was Navoch and he doesn't understand what he's seeing. And he asks the Malach, what does it mean? And the Malach didn't tell him what it meant. So here we see how you have a person dreams. A person who dreams can have a divrei shav, and then divrei shav is transformed into an image. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. Then you have a person who has a true message from a Malach that gives him a true message, and then that message is transformed into a vision.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of people at a lower level like Daniel, he won't understand the meaning. In the case of a Navi like Yeshaya, he also remembers the dream and also remembers what the dream was transformed from, which is the original message.
Fascinating. Interesting.
Right.
I think maybe we should.
Yes, I think it's a good place to stop. Hazak Baruch.
Exactly.